I've been wanting to make another coffee table, and I thought I would use the red alder that I cut down with my friend Gabe and the maple that was delivered a few years back and I milled up. And maybe I can finally get through most of the maple. This is the piece of alder, and I'm going to cut a piece of the end off for the top. The idea I want to try with this coffee table is to make a single piece top, then attach the legs in a similar way that I put the mallets that I've been making together. So I'd make sort of a radial joint. Then I would carve away all of the extra material, and you'd be able to see that joint as it comes up and connects the legs to the top. So this is the piece of alder, and I can cut up the maple pieces that I'm going to use. A lot of this wood isn't in very good shape, but hopefully I can find some pieces that'll work. I don't want to cut this at first on the table saw, as it doesn't really sit flat enough to be safe on the table saw. So I can draw a line and then sort of cut by eye on the bandsaw and get this into some big rough pieces. And once they're a little more manageable, I can cut the pieces down on the joiner and the planer. And once I have some flat surfaces to work with, I can cut the pieces to size on the table saw. So the idea with the legs is I will just glue up a bunch of these pieces to get the mass that I need to make sort of a cone shape. So it's just a matter of making a bunch of slabs and gluing them together. I was both thinking about the joint that I needed to cut and the mass that I needed, but also how to hold this on a CNC machine, as I needed some flat edges for that to work. When I made these, the plan was that this smallest piece would sit on the edge of the table, but as you can kind of see, it just barely hits the edge. I should have made these just slightly wider, or not cut them down and left them wider. But they work. I thought about cutting a little piece to fit in that space, but there's no way to really attach it because there's a hinge right here. I thought about having a piece of plywood come off, sort of clamp it down and have it stick out so this could sit on that. But that would take some setup, and it's not really that hard to clamp it in place with this. It's mostly a matter of holding it up. Once I get one clamp on there, then it's pretty easy. Little scrap pieces fits down here, and it was staying there better. There's sort of a gap that'd be nice to fill with a scrap piece, so the clamp has something to push against. I can find the center, and I can cut the joint. And the first thing I do in cutting the joint is to flatten the top, so I have a nice, even surface to cut the joint into. And the parts of the joint are all exactly the same height if I do that. I have the 4 legs cut now. I can start to work on the top. I need to hold this on the CNC machine. So I cut some places where I can use my hold down tabs at the corners of the slab. It's too thick for the hold down tabs to work. So the piece at the moment isn't flat, so I can use shims at the corners to help hold the piece in a specific location, basically to keep it from rocking back and forth. And you can see how the hold down clamps fit in the corners. And I'll use some more clamps at the edges just to hold the piece in place. Then I can flatten this face with the CNC machine. I've got a somewhat cheap 2-inch bit that works pretty well. And I put my dust collection back on. It's been off for a while. But doing this kind of slabbing work really makes a lot of chips. So you really need the dust collection. I did several passes. I think I was going down about 0.2 of an inch on each pass. Roughly 0.5 centimeter, maybe a little less than that. And one face is flat, and I can tip the piece over. And I want to get all the dust and the chips off of the table so the piece will sit flat. Once I have a flat face on the table, I don't need to worry about holding it down so much. I just need to keep it from sliding around. So I have my hold down clamps on the edges just to keep the piece from moving. But the weight of the piece will hold itself down. And I can flatten this face. I restarted it a few times to get it to the right depth. I was sort of going along and it wasn't quite as deep as I wanted it, so I restarted it, I think 3 times here. Then I could cut out the shape of the table. So I've cut a slot around the edge of the workpiece, and that gives me the shape of the table. And I couldn't quite go the full depth because it's a little more than the 2-inch maximum on that router bit. I can cut the rest of this off with a bandsaw and then clean up what's left with the shaper. So that's not a big deal. What I want to do now is to widen this slot a little bit and widen it not quite as deep as it is here. And that'll leave me a little edge on the underside of the top surface. And it'll give me the edge of the tabletop of the coffee table. I can then use that as a guide to hand carve or sort of hand shape the underside of the coffee table. So the big idea is that I won't carve the final 3-dimensional form with the CNC, but I'll use the CNC to set up some guides so that when I hand shape the 3-dimensional form, I have some sort of reference points. I can have a nice kind of sharp edge around the frame of the tabletop, and then I can have a more curvy kind of free-flowing form underneath. In looking at the geometry of the table, I decided I wanted to add a little more thickness to the top. So I cut out 4 pieces from another piece of the alder, and I jointed and planed those pieces. And in looking at it, it felt a little bit too thick, so I resawed the piece down, and I cut 4 blocks out of that, 1 for each leg. And I'm going to glue these to the underside of the table. And I figured out approximately where I wanted them. And I lifted the table up so I could fit clamps onto these pieces. And I glued them in place. So this will give me a little more thickness for that joint with the leg. So I have the legs glued up, and I have the joint cut in the end of the leg. And what I think I want to do now is to start to shape these and get them a little closer to their final form. And I want to start doing that by trimming off a bunch of the mass on the bandsaw. So I'll kind of cut a leg shape into this. And then once I do that, I have this round, sort of the roundness of this joint. I can hold this on the lathe now. And I was thinking I could turn off a little more of the mass on the lathe and get a little closer to the shape. It won't be the final form, but it'll give me sort of a reference once everything's glued together as to the shape of the underside of the table. I can find the center of the foot end of the leg, and I mark them for height, so they'll all be sort of the same length. I can start to turn the first leg. I like this big gouge that I have for spindles, especially big spindles. It takes off a lot of material quickly. I can get to the shape pretty quickly. What also helped with these legs is that they were fairly balanced right off the start, so I could turn the speed up fairly quickly right at the beginning, which that meant that it went pretty fast. The faster you can turn the speed up on the lathe, the faster you can cut material away in general. I made them all the same, but I knew they weren't really going to be the final form. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't cutting too much away and that I would have something to work with once everything was in place on the table. At the beginning it was kind of a little bit chattery, but it turns just fine. I did sand them, but in the end that wasn't necessary at this point because I ended up shaping pretty much the entire surface of the legs. I've been experimenting with using my grinder as a sander. So I was kind of guessing at the angles. I had an idea and I did a drawing that helped, but it was still a little bit of guesswork on the angles. So I have the tabletop mounted to my vertical table on the CNC, and I think it's going to hold it well enough. It presented a couple of problems when I was trying to do this. One was this edge on the edge of the main table on the CNC was in the way. When this vertical table is up high enough, whatever's clamped to it starts to hit this edge. So I had to sort of shim up the tabletop to pass that edge. And that seems to be working now. It also took a couple of tries to get the fence attached, so that angle will now be set. I needed it in a place where I could fit the clamps through the holes to hold the workpiece around the fence. That seems to be working now. I kind of solved the two problems together where I clamped these furring strips under the fence, so the fence is kind of holding the furring strips in place too. So that was kind of nice. So the idea with this is that the angle that this is clamped at will be the angle that the legs are set against the tabletop. The idea at this point is to flatten the corner and then cut the receiving joint for the leg into this, and the leg can then attach to the bottom of the table. And then once all four legs are set and everything's ready, then I'll sort of hand carve everything on the bottom and hopefully get a nice shape. Once I did one of the corners, I would rotate the tabletop around 180 degrees and do the opposite corner. After finding the center, I would draw a circle that was approximately the size of the joint. And that would help in knowing how much of the piece to flatten. I needed to make the flat spot as big as that circle. Once I had the piece flat, I then had to change bits to a 1/4 inch bit to do the joint. And I had to reset the height to that new flat surface. So the joint would be the same depth as the joint cut into the leg, as the top and bottom of that joint also had to fit tight. Once I had two of the corners done, I had to move the fence, sort of mirror it to the other side of the table at that same angle in a mirrored position. And the clamps on the fence don't really hold that much, so I didn't use them on this section. I just left the fence sort of backwards in a way. The fence is really just there to reference the piece when it's being put in place. And I can do the final corner. I flattened the piece with a 1 inch bit and then cut the joint with a 1/4 inch bit. All four corners are now done, and I didn't have any screw-ups, which is good. Make sure they all fit. I needed to figure out how to clamp these while the glue is drying. And I decided at this point I should cut the legs closer to their final length. I think I'm ready to glue the legs in place. I've had to spend a little time figuring out a way to clamp the legs in once the glue is in there. I think in my mind all along, I've been thinking I would use one of these at each leg, but they're not nearly long enough. And these clamps don't really have enough reach to go from the table into the bottom of the leg. So I made sort of a wooden beam with some holes that will make a spot for the foot to go. And then I can clamp the legs in pairs across the width of the table. And this as a dry fit seems to be working. So now sort of the moment of truth and put the glue in place. So the glue went in just fine. Okay, the glue is set up and everything should be together now. I can take the clamps off. It's at this point where I wonder if this is better just left as it is, or do I carve it? Like, will I screw it up when I try and shape it? Or is it better just the way it is? Because it's actually kind of cool, although it is a little lumpy. I suppose I could make it a little lighter if I carve it. I guess now that I'm looking at it, if I don't carve it, then I'll never see the joint that the whole point of this project is all about. So I need to carve. So I carved and carved and carved. I was using the Arbortech disc, which is sort of nice in that it makes chips instead of dust. And I started by trying to reveal the joint and kind of removing the bulk of the material with a thought of what the final form is going to be. I used an electric chainsaw to get out some of the material between the legs. I think if I were to do this again, I would have put the legs just slightly further away from each other. It's okay the way it is, but I think maybe half an inch further apart would have been good. Once I had the table and the joint cut, I decided the legs were a little too thick. My wife called them fleshy. I sort of skinnied those up a little bit, gave them a little more of a conical shape, I guess. I've got some grinding discs that are a little more just abrasive, and those worked sort of for the next phase, where I still wanted to remove material, but not quite so quickly, and I could be a little more delicate with the shape. Then after the grinding discs, I've been playing around with sanding pads on the grinder, which work great for about 15 seconds. Then the sandpaper gets destroyed. But those work pretty well. I cleaned up and then kind of did the finish sanding. And once I had the shape pretty much to where I wanted it, I got out my small random orbital sander and I went around and did all the surfaces up to 240, I think. It was sort of hard because I'd get it smooth and then I would have to go back a few sanding grits to take out divots and bumps that I didn't want. I flattened the feet and got them sort of finished and also leveled the table so it wouldn't rock on the floor, so that all the legs are the same length, basically. Then the final thing was to sand the top and the edges, and that was straightforward, as it's just flat. Then I put finish on. I got a can of Osmo, I think that's how you say it, which I've heard good things about. I thought I would try that, and it went on nicely. It says to put it on very thin, so I would put it on with a brush and then wipe it off with a rag. That got a really thin coat. I've got a little bit of an issue on the top where there were some pores, I guess, or places where it wasn't perfectly flat, and now the finish is sort of has a white residue in there. I guess it's a wax and oil finish. So maybe I should have spent more time on the top instead of all the time on the bottom. But it came out really nice. The idea of the joints on the legs worked. I actually found a form within everything that I glued together that works. So it's done. The top isn't quite as nice as I would have liked, but it's really about for the underside, where the legs are. It's really more for the cats. Thanks for watching.